experts offering clear and insightful explanation on the issues shaping the news. This is actually where we break down the biggest stories with the sharpest mind, real conversation with domain experts on the topics making headlines right now. I am Manas Srivastava. Now, today's Explain Live focuses on something very constant in the headlines and a question in everybody's mind who is interested in global news and international relations. With the US moves on Venezuela and Iran, what next? The US capture of Venezuela president and threats to intervene in Iran has been in the news. We all know that. And so the questions in everybody's mind, like what does US intervention in Venezuela mean for the world order? And how significant are these protests in Iran and how strong or weak is the Iranian regime? What does US intervention in Venezuela and possible escalation in Iran mean for India? And what will be India's role? Now, these questions are very important in everyone's mind, and the Indian Express will pose these questions and more to our expert guest today. And I welcome Mr. K Sinha, former Indian ambassador to Venezuela. Sir has also managed India's bilateral ties with Iran as a joint secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, and he has also served as India's High Commissioner to UK and Sri Lanka. He will be in conversation with Shubhajit Roy, our diplomatic editor at the Indian Express. Now, before we go forward and I hand it over to Shubhajit, a quick, how do we do this Explain Live? So first, there will be a meaningful conversation between our editor and the guest. And meanwhile, you can keep asking us questions, keep sending us questions. We will try to take as many questions as possible towards the end of the discussion. It is possible that a lot of questions which you are sending to us or posting will be answered while the conversation is going on. So stay tuned, and we hope that most of your questions will be answered while the discussion is on. So coming back to our important explanatory live on the current issue of the US moves on Venezuela and Iran, what next? Over to you, Shubhajit.
Thank you. Thank you, Manas, for this introduction. And I warmly welcome Mr. K Sinha, who I've had the privilege of knowing over the last almost 2 decades now. And he's one of India's finest minds on geopolitics, on foreign policy, having held 3 very important ambassadorial positions, as you mentioned, to UK, Sri Lanka, and Venezuela. And here we are, talking to him about Venezuela. And also, as Manas pointed out, he had, handled the relationship with Iran, as well as, just to add, he had also handled India's relations with Pakistan and Afghanistan at that point of time in the Ministry of External Affairs. So Venezuela and Iran have been in the news in the past, in the first half of this month, in the last 20 days of the year. And I wanted to kind of put both these topics under one basket. And I couldn't think of a better person who could link the two and the US moves than Mr. Sinha. Welcome, Mr. Sinha.
Thank you, Shubhajit. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you for joining us. So just as, setting the scene, setting the stage, on Venezuela, we saw in early January, after months of saber rattling by the Trump administration, US forces raided Venezuela and captured its leader, Nicolás Maduro. Trump has suggested that United States could run the country. In fact, he put out a meme also saying that he was the acting president of Venezuela and has demanded a huge stake in Venezuela's vast oil resources. Maduro, meanwhile, sits in a New York jail awaiting his next court date in March and also his fate and future as the trial begins. But much remains unclear about what happens in Venezuela with Maduro gone, but his regime largely still in place. how his ouster affects the wider region, and what's next as the Trump administration flexes its muscles in Latin America. On Iran, to set the scene, over 2 weeks into wide scale protests against the Islamic Republic regime in Iran, which began on December 28th, following economic sort of situation, the death toll and number of arrests were rapidly mounting because of the huge crackdown by the Iranian regime. Now, Iranian human rights organizations have put the number of dead at more than 2,500, some say 3,000, while there are other sources that suggest it may exceed 10,000. Trump declared on January 2nd that United States was locked and loaded, indicating that his administration was examining military options, and pronounced later that the Iranian regime had crossed a red line. And on January 13th, he said help is on its way. But then the Iranian regime did a communications blackout, cracked down on the protesters, and we saw the protests die down. These were the largest protests that have happened in Iran in decades, possibly the biggest since the 79 revolution. Trump repeatedly threatened to hit hard if protesters were killed, but later softened when he commended Tehran for cancelling hundreds of scheduled executions. Now, in Davos yesterday, he said that he hopes there will be no need for further US military action in Iran. Iran obviously has always said there will be a retaliation to any US action. Now, I would start off this discussion by coming to you, Mr. Sinha, like firstly on Venezuela. Now, you were posted there as India's ambassador. What does US intervention in Venezuela mean for Venezuela, the country where you were posted?
Shubhajit, I think we live in a dystopian age. We are 22 days into the new year, and it's been an action-packed January, and I'm sure there'll be more to follow. 3rd of January, of course, is when the American forces swooped in the stealth of the night and abducted President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. And then what followed after that was actually a bizarre chain of events. You referred to the press conference that President Trump had, where he declared himself acting president, and then he said the people behind him would run Venezuela. But then what actually happened was that the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, has been sworn in as president. Now, what is intriguing is that the Maduro regime, though without its leader, remains more or less intact. And there are hints, there are statements actually, that they are going to play ball with the Americans as far as oil is concerned. After all, it was oil that really brought the Americans in. Even earlier, if you recall, when the Venezuelan oil industry was developed, when PDVSA, the national oil company, was set up in 1976, and then it was, of course, it was owned by the government. The oil industry was nationalized, and in 2007, President Chavez nationalized PDVSA completely. And that led to an exodus of American and European oil companies. So oil is the wealth, and you're aware that Venezuela has 303 billion barrels of oil reserves, the largest in the world. So I think
17% of the world's proven reserves.
That's correct. So what's clear is that the US is after Venezuelan oil. They will now control the you've heard about how tankers have been seized even after Maduro's arraignment. So I think it is quite clear that oil seems to be the larger motive, but control of Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, as President Trump terms it, is something that the US desires. And he himself said that perhaps They have moved from a Monroe doctrine to a Donroe doctrine. So I think there are interesting times ahead, not only for Latin America, but for the whole world. Because since then, as you mentioned, the Iran protests have erupted and President Trump was ready to go in, though I'm not sure whether he would really want to, because Iran is a different kettle of fish. And of course, yesterday and day before, you saw what played out regarding Greenland. So it is truly a dystopian world.
Having served there, Mr. Sinha, while you were there, Chavez was the president, and then Maduro was the foreign minister at that point of time. Take us through that time when Maduro, as a foreign minister, how key a player at that time he was.
When I went there in January 2007, if I recall correctly, I was in Dubai earlier, and I sort of went on a cross posting to Venezuela. It was my first experience of being posted in Latin America and South America. And I must say, when I landed there, I was struck by the beauty of the place. Caracas sits at about 3,000 feet, though the airport is on the sea, and you drive about 29 kilometers into Caracas through tunnels. Of course, the infrastructure was pretty well developed. But President Chavez had been in power since 1999, and he came riding a wave of public support, basically against the oligarchs that had ruled Venezuela before that and had cornered a large chunk of the wealth, the oil wealth of Venezuela. So Chavez's election on a socialist, they called it a Bolivarian socialist platform, was basically a result of that. And he came in with a majority, of course, and he was very charismatic. So when I presented my credentials to President Chavez at Miraflores Palace, within, I think, a couple of weeks of my arrival, which was considered to be extraordinary because people waited a few months, sometimes 6 months, and there have been bizarre stories of ambassadors sitting in their cars and going towards the presidential palace and then rung up on their mobiles and said the ceremony has been postponed. But I was lucky, I was fortunate. I was able to present my credentials immediately on arrival. And at that time, Mr. Nicolás Maduro was the foreign minister. So I had the opportunity of meeting him on several occasions, both President Chavez and Mr. Maduro. And I also met Mr. Maduro's wife, Celia Flores, who was at that time the president of the National Assembly. And I must confess that I found Ms. Flores quite well informed, perhaps better informed than her husband.
Right. And, the kind of administration President Chavez ran, was he popular at that point of time amongst the people of the country?
Yes, very popular, extremely charismatic, very good orator. He would hold people spellbound. And if I remember correctly, there was a Sunday program on television called Allo Presidente, in which he would emulate his benefactor and idol Fidel Castro and speak for hours on end. And I think the fact that he was a good orator actually mattered. But I think he had a lot of public support, definitely initially. But unfortunately, things ran aground. And during that regime, during Chavez's time itself, you could see problems emerging in terms of scarcity, economic problems, the currency being devalued multiple times, in effect being devalued multiple times, and the seeds of the economic crisis had already been sown.
Right. And when Maduro, I remember when Chavez, he died, India sent, I think at that point of time, MOS Sachin Pilot for his funeral. And at that point of time, the relationship was really blossoming at that point of time. What happened between India and Venezuela, the relationship? How do you see the arc and the trajectory of the relationship?
India has actually had pretty close relations with Venezuela for actually quite some time. If I take you back to 1968, when Mrs. Indira Gandhi landed in Caracas, she was received with great honors by President Leone. And the streets of Caracas were decked up to welcome the Indian Prime Minister. So much so that in 1971, during the war with Pakistan, Venezuela was one of the few countries that came out openly in support of India. So we've had rather close and good relations with Venezuela. When I was there, President Chavez was actually planning to come to India for the second time in 2007, but that visit didn't materialize. It was for a party function. The president of the Congress Party had invited him to India, but that visit didn't materialize. But he'd been there earlier, and he had been received very well here. And he was very fond of India. He would speak very fondly. He remembered the contributions of recalled with great admiration, in fact, the contributions of Mahatma Gandhi to our freedom struggle. And he read, and he was aware of India's role. And I think that is the time when India started buying, or Indian companies started buying oil from Venezuela. When I was there, if I recall correctly, we were buying almost 200,000 barrels of oil per day, mainly Reliance, but SR also. You must understand that the crude that Venezuela has is heavy sour crude, which cannot be refined by all the refineries, particularly in India. Our PSUs, our public sector refineries weren't able to really refine that crude, but in Jamnagar, both SR and Reliance and SR were able to. But Reliance was a major buyer, and I believe later on, Indian imports of oil stepped up till sanctions kicked in 2019.
Right. And what about the system of regime? Because you describe as a very sort of vibrant administration, but the system that, there's an allegation that Maduro sat on a much more corrupt administration. Does that hold water?
Absolutely, because what happened during Chavez's time also, you had these gangs that were not necessarily associated with the regime, but they were because Chavez armed the common people, with there was an attempt at a coup against him. So guns were freely available, and there were carjackings and robberies in broad daylight. So I think the law and order situation had deteriorated considerably. And, unfortunately, as happens in these systems, when you go into a socialist system of government, that itself breeds its own oligarchy. And in fact, in Venezuela, they were called the boligarchy that emerged during Chavez's time. And
oligarchy.
The Bolivar and Boligar.
Okay.
Oligarchy. So I think, unfortunately, things started going south pretty early. And coupled with that, of course, is the fact that oil production was severely hit because the engineers and the investors, etc., had left Venezuela. I'm talking about the foreign, mainly American and European. And Venezuela was not being able to produce or extract oil to its potential. So as a result, I think oil production went down considerably during the period from Chavez to Maduro. And during Maduro's time, I think it was almost negligible. So that was unfortunate. That led to economic misery because oil was the mainstay. And the people suffered tremendously, especially during Maduro's time. Economic deprivation, terrible law and order, and of course, Maduro's popularity had plummeted after during the last two elections that he contested. The first one, they say he lost. The second one, he most definitely lost, at least from all indications, but he got himself declared a victor.
Yeah. And what about the sort of the drugs situation there? Was it very prevalent, and was it sort of supplier of transnational drugs? Was that a big menace?
Shubhajit, that surprises me a bit. The charge that he indulged in, or Maduro in this case, indulged in narco trafficking, and that he headed a cartel. I find that quite incredible because while of course drugs were there in Venezuela as in anywhere else in that part of the world, Venezuela was not known to be a conduit for drug trafficking. I know that the Venezuela and Colombia share a porous border, and Colombia, of course, is notorious for its drug cartels and a source of cocaine into the U.S. Mexico is a conduit for fentanyl, I understand. But Venezuela was never really considered, even in internal reports in the United States, considered a conduit or a supplier of drugs to the US. So this must have been a later development. However, I think when the trial begins in the New York court, perhaps we will get to know more because evidence will have to be produced. The fact linking Maduro and his henchmen, his cabal, to drug trafficking. So, I mean, we'll have to wait and watch. But to answer your question, yes, drugs were available, but certainly not the menace that it's made out to be or perhaps became later.
Yeah, I think you've raised a very important point that, once the trial starts in New York in the US court, then the US prosecutors will have to produce tangible, credible evidence linking President Maduro with a former President Maduro to the drug cartels of Venezuela. That is something is very crucial to remember in this fog of allegations and information and misinformation that's on. I want to come to the current day, and we see in the post-Maduro regime, what you've also alluded to is that it's not a regime change, but a leadership change. And essentially, one person has been changed, which is Nicolas Maduro, whereas the rest of the system remains intact, which is headed by or managed by Delcy Rodriguez. Can you give us a sense of how this post-Maduro regime is surviving, and who are the actors and playing a role, and what is the state of play there?
You see, as I said, that his henchmen remain very much in place. The number two, the effective number two, I mean, apart from Delcy Rodriguez, who was the number two in terms of being vice president, the real strongman of the party, Diosdado Cabello, who is the interior minister and who was governor of the state of Miranda when I was there, is a very powerful figure. He was even during Chavez's time. In fact, he was expected to be Chavez's successor. But Cabello has been indicted by the New York court along with Maduro, Celia Flores, and their son. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because Cabello is very much in position as far as I know, and so is Padrino, the defense minister, another strong personality in the party. But Delcy Rodriguez has, of course, the pedigree, a socialist pedigree. Her father was an ideologue who was killed in jail. And the brother, Jorge, I think, was the president of the National Assembly and an ideologue of the party. So I think it's the Bolivarian apparatus as set up by Chavez and continued by Maduro is very much in place. The people of Venezuela, who I'm sure would have rejoiced at Maduro's, or at a large number, rejoiced at Maduro's removal, however, have not really spoken because the opposition has been sidelined, so to speak. I mean, I was very surprised that the candidate who was supposed to have won the last election in 2024, Edmundo Gonzalez, last I heard, he was in exile in Spain. And Maria Corina Machado, who is the most popular leader in Venezuela, recently met President Trump and, of course, gave him her Nobel Peace Prize. But that apart, I think President Trump had really marginalized her earlier. The press conference, if you recall, he discounted the popularity, the extent of popularity she has. So, but how do you gauge that? Because there haven't been free and fair elections for quite some time in Venezuela. So if there are free and fair elections held soon, then I think it'd be quite apparent who the popular leader of Venezuela is. But I'm afraid the way things are going, I'm not sure whether the US has free and fair elections in mind right now. Right now, it's the oil, stupid, as they say.
Yeah, very well put. Now I'll move to Iran, where which also you've handled as a joint secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, and we saw that these protests they came about, and many said that this was the biggest protest they've seen in a long, long time. As a Iran watcher, what is your sense? How important, how significant were these protests?
Shubhajit, I'm terribly saddened at this immense loss of life, the latest round of protests. Iran is truly, and so is Venezuela, but Iran certainly is truly a very beautiful country. It's a civilizational state. I've visited Iran at least 7 times between 2009 and 13, and I was struck by the vibrant history of that country, the civilization of that country, the art, the architecture, the painting, etc. And it's sad to see all that being sort of jeopardized by a regime which has actually based itself on the most brutal or adopted the most brutal tactics to suppress the popular will. And what we see happening in Iran is really sad. And I think you're right, it is the biggest protest. There have been a series of protests since the time of the revolution, if I remember correctly, 1999, 2009, 10, 11, 13. But these are the largest protests. Unfortunately, we really don't know how large they were in terms of, people on the streets, because there was a complete internet blackout imposed by the authorities. And as a result, we don't even know exactly how many people died. I believe Iranian state television is now admitted to 3,112, but I'm sure the figure is much, much larger. And even though one's not hearing of protests, maybe because of the blackout, but more likely because of the brutal tactics of the police and the Basij militia, the Revolutionary Guard, they've all been deployed against their own people.
Yeah. Each time there are these protests, and we've been having these conversations within ourselves that were these the protests that could have led to a regime change? And so, linked, before I ask this question, I want to get a sense from you how strong, how weak is the regime in Iran?
Shubhajit, now I haven't been for a while. I just but when I used to visit Iran, the regime was pretty strongly entrenched. There were dissident voices, but either they were jailed or they went into exile. So I think even the earlier protests were brutally suppressed and crushed. This time round, the magnitude is larger, and one really can't get a true picture. All I can say is that there is considerable vested interest in the continuation of the Ayatollahs and the regime. And the reason being that these are the people who have benefited, whether it's the IRGC and their families, the militias, the clerics, etc. But there are, I don't know how big a chunk of the population, but certainly an important section of society that continues to back the regime. And the regime is entrenched. If they have to be removed, that is, they have to be removed lock, stock, and barrel. They have to be uprooted. For that, means these simple unarmed or even armed protests that have taken place may not suffice.
Right. And this round of protests started with the economic situation. The traders, the bazaar, as they say, the bazaris, they came out and started protesting. If you could give us a sense from your time and now how bad the situation has become economically.
When the protest started against the Shah in 1979, it was these traders, these bazaris, who actually began the protest because of economic hardship. And this time around, it was the same bazaris. I was surprised that the Bazaar-e-Buzurg, the Grand Bazaar in Tehran, was shut, and traders sort of shuttered their shops and came out on the streets to protest. But the economic situation was very dire in Iran, is very dire in Iran, again, because of sanctions which have been biting, not begun to bite. They've been biting for a while, but things have come to a head. And the currency has fallen dramatically. The real and oil production has been impacted. And externally, I think the attacks last year by Israel and the US came as a big blow to Iran, not just the destruction in terms of their nuclear facilities, but also the psychological blow in terms of the invincibility of the regime. So I think the opponents of the regime were encouraged. The regime was on the defensive, and with these protests breaking out, large-scale protests, of course, they blame the protests on the West. They blame the protests on Israel, but obviously there was enough enough grievances that had mounted that resulted to this sort of outpouring of anger and against the regime in Iran. So I think it is significant. I think the last word has not been written on these protests. I don't think, going by what President Trump said, even though he dispatched the USS Abraham Lincoln and some refueling planes to the Middle East a few days ago, I'm not sure whether what he plans, because an air attack or a missile attack may not be enough to remove the regime. And even if Ayatollah Khamenei is removed from the scene, the IRGC and the militias supporting the regime will be very much entrenched, will be very much there, and probably will call the shots. So it would take much more than an aerial attack really to uproot this regime. But then one cannot really say, because we really don't know what the situation is inside Iran right now because of the complete news blackout.
And India's relations with Iran, which you managed, how has that atrophied? Has that diminished over a period of time?
Unfortunately, yes. Iran is such an important neighbor right through history. If you go back to the time of Cyrus the Great and Darius and Xerxes and their magnificent capital, Persepolis, which I had the pleasure of visiting, you would actually see, on their walls, depictions of chieftains from all over paying tribute. And I was told that there were chieftains from our part of the world, like Pakistan, Afghanistan, that recognized the suzerainty of the Persian emperor. But even then, even after that, you had the case of Humayun seeking shelter in Tehran, in Persia. And in fact, in Isfahan, there is a painting of him beseeching the Persian Shah, I think with the Hemsep, seeking assistance. And when Humayun actually came back to India and fought the Second Battle of Panipat, he did so with great amount of assistance from Persia. And he had brought with him artists, architects, painters, and Persian obviously became the court language right up to the British times. So I think the influence that Iran and India have had on each other has been tremendous through the ages. And even when I was in charge of looking after that Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran division, the relationship was good. Even with the Ayatollahs in power, there were frequent exchanges. I recall Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, in fact, going for the NAM summit. I think it was July or August 2012. There have been visits. In fact, I even met when I was part of the delegation that met Ayatollah Khamenei. He wouldn't meet most people, but he did meet, if I recall correctly, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And even if earlier, I think he met our External Affairs Minister. So I think we had very close relations. We imported a lot of oil. Even when sanctions were in place, we were able to, I won't say evade sanctions, but we were able to skirt around the sanctions by opening escrow accounts in banks that were not exposed to the US. But at that time, it was tough. Now it is much more difficult, especially with a regime administration in the US that is taking an extremely tough line. In fact, even Chabahar, I remember visiting Chabahar it was, I think, November 2011 with the ambassador, and I was struck on how Chabahar could be developed as an alternative for supply routes for our exports to Afghanistan and to Central Asia. In fact, we even met people who were were using trucks to cross into Afghanistan. And, India built the Zaranj-Dilaram highway. So we could have actually, our shipments could have gone and did go, in fact, from Chabahar into Afghanistan. And once a rail link, which was, of course, it commenced but never really completed because of sanctions and the dire economic situation. But once rail links were established to Mashhad and beyond to Central Asia, India would find a viable route bypassing Pakistan into Afghanistan and Central Asia. In fact, the US recognized that. And I recall both of the governments in Afghanistan, with President Karzai and President Ghani, and even the Taliban regime, have been very supportive of Chabahar being used as a route for supplies into Afghanistan. But once the US left, we did get an exemption. And now I believe the current exemption is expiring April this year. And that the indications are that we may not be able to proceed. But I would be very sad if we were to completely walk away from Chabahar. We just have to be patient, because our investments may not be too much in Chabahar, but it is a very important gateway to Afghanistan and Central Asia, and we should keep our interest in Chabahar alive, so that at a future date we can again revive. Whichever regime is in power in Iran, we could revive those links and use Chabahar profitably.
Right. Now I would want to, put your thinking cap on, and that what does this U.S. intervention in Venezuela and a possible escalation in Iran mean for the world order?
Well, I can't do better than quote Prime Minister Ghani that there has been a rupture and not a transition. I think the rules-based international order has been stood on its head as we knew it. I mean, 37 years of diplomacy or being a diplomat didn't really prepare me for such an eventuality, because we were trying to reform the system from within. And I'm talking about the United Nations, whether it was the Security Council or other organs of the United Nations and other multilateral organizations like the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. But now, I think the rules of the game have changed completely. I think it is might is right, and what I want is mine. So I think we have to be extremely cautious on how we proceed, because, we are a big power, we are a big country, but I'm sure our decision makers are weighing things very carefully, because I think no country is immune. I mean, even the allies of the United States, you saw the drama played out on Greenland. I couldn't ever visualize that there would be a threat of tariffs on NATO allies. The tariffs have been weaponized. We are aware we're bearing the brunt of 50% tariffs. But the fact is that nobody really knows what is going to happen tomorrow. So I think we need to be vigilant. And at the same time, we keep all our bets open. I mean, we are hedging, we are multi-aligning, that's good. But I think we need to do more in terms of reaching out to other partners. And glad that we have the president of the European Commission and the European Council visiting as chief guests. And I do hope that the FTA will be chief guest for the Republic Day next week. And I do hope that the FTA will be concluded during that visit, because that would be a very important milestone. The EU is a very major partner. So I think we are preparing for the worst in terms of trying to reach out to multiple partners. And we are fortunate in this regard that we've had good relations with a whole host of countries across the globe. So I think even though we may not have an FTA with our biggest trading partner, hopefully we would have not only FTAs, but good economic link-ups with other major and not so major powers across the globe.
Well, you talked about India, sort of how it also has an impact on India, just like rest of the world. Should India take a position on this US interventionism?
Well, you see, it depends. Now, I mean, obviously, our reaction to Maduro's abduction was muted. I mean, we did express concern, but we were mindful of, the larger issues. And let's be quite frank. I mean, the US is our most important partner, despite all the hiccups that we faced recently. And I think the government was very mindful of that and issued a very measured statement. But if, for instance, anything happens in Iran, obviously we would have to take note of that, because that's in our extended neighborhood. And we have had centuries, millennia of close relations with that country. So I think that would really upset the apple cart, if I could put it that way, as far as this region is concerned. I'm not sure how that will take place, because as I said, America is loath to put boots on the ground, and wherever they have done so, they have suffered in terms of they've had to withdraw, whether it was Afghanistan or Vietnam or wherever else. So I think we will have to wait and see what the US does in terms of Iran, and how the situation in Iran itself pans out, because obviously we are watching this very closely, as I said, because it is in our extended region.
Right. Before I move to the audience Q&A, audience, and there are many on the chat box, as well as, we have curated some of them. So wanted to get a sense from you, what if you were in Foreign Office today, in India's MEA, first on Venezuela, what would you have done differently? And as JS Pi, as JS Iran, what would you have done differently?
Well, as regards Venezuela, I think I wouldn't have done things too much more differently, perhaps gone a bit beyond expressing concern, but there's very little that we could do. And of course, we are cognizant of the fact that the Maduro regime was highly unpopular. So, we have links with the Venezuelan people, of course, with the governments, but Maduro and his regime were extremely unpopular. And I think Maduro's removal actually would be welcomed by a large section of the Venezuelan people. So I would more or less stick to the line that the government took. Of course, the action itself of going in the stealth of the night and picking up legitimate or illegitimate president, and it depends on how you view him, is obviously contravention of all tenets of international law. So obviously that is something that would certainly bother me and should bother everyone, because this sets a very bad precedent. So as far as Iran is concerned, I sort of hold my peace right now, because we'll have to wait and see what happens before I decide what sort of statement or what sort of reaction we'll have. All I can say is that I would certainly feel very bad and very sad about the loss of life in these protests that have taken place the last 3 weeks or more in Iran.
Thank you. I'll move to audience questions, and I have a question from Darshana Vyas. Darshana Vyas, if you could unmute yourself and ask a question. Please unmute yourself, Darshana.
I think we can move to the next question in case she's not there.
Okay. I wanted to then take a question from from the chat box. So Atul Kumar Oja, he has asked a question. Indian government's muted response stands in sharp contrast to the Chinese response. How India can establish its credentials by just sitting on the fence, and so that's the basic sort of question of his.
No, I think you must understand China's interests and involvement in Venezuela were far greater than India's. In fact, China and Russia, particularly China, because they have deep pockets, had invested in Venezuela and were propping up a regime which was highly unpopular. They had invested, they even supplied defense equipment, and obviously they will express concern because a lot of their equipment was basically didn't count for much in terms of saving their protege, Nicolás Maduro. So obviously, the reaction of India and China would be completely different. India was not necessarily sitting on the fence, but I think India was obviously taking into account its larger relationships, the larger worldview, and its most important relationship with the United States. So I think you've got to be aware and cognizant of that fact. So I think China's reaction was quite on expected lines.
Okay. Next question is from Ashwini Gupta.
Sir, my question has been, this is Ashwini Gupta.
Yeah.
I'm a freelance journalist. Part of my questions have already been answered by the speaker, but I will come to the main question. My question is, how does Ambassador Sinha do the following among people in Venezuela, Iran, and also the United States for different options? If the United States doesn't succeed in immediately achieving a military objective, would there be adequate popular support for a prolonged confrontation among voters in America? And similarly, considering different scenarios in Venezuela and Iran, what are the different shades of following among ordinary people for different leaders or different possible governments? Thank you.
If I could understand your question, Mr. Gupta, I think if you're asking about, as far as Venezuela is concerned, the military action has taken place. What will happen is really unclear. Fact that Maduro is gone is something that a large section, if I won't say majority, perhaps majority, because the last elections, the claim was at least that Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition candidate, had won 70% of the vote. If that is correct, then I would think that there would be a large section supporting the ouster of Maduro, but not necessarily supporting the Americans, because the Venezuelans are proud people, and I'm not sure that they'd like to have their acting president sitting in the White House. So I think they wouldn't like to be run by another country or the president of another country. So I think how the situation plays out in Venezuela is worth watching. As I said, that if free and fair elections are held, I presume that the opposition candidate will win, whoever the opposition, whether it's Maria Corina Machado, who's now also been recognized in terms of being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Whether if she's allowed to stand, she probably will win hands down, but we'll have to wait and see. I can't really predict what's going to happen. I don't think the Venezuelan military would want to take on the US might. I don't think they can. And what happened on the 3rd of January clearly prove that they were caught completely flat-footed. As far as Iran is concerned, it's a completely different case there, because Iran is stronger. There are many more people. The regime is more firmly entrenched. And as I said, the Americans will have to probably put boots on the ground. I understand, I mean, they're hearsay, and I cannot really give any credence to it, that there are militias being formed and groups outside the borders of Iran being formed, encouraged, funded, whatever, to go in and do the dirty work of the Americans. But I'm not sure whether that will succeed. So the military options in Iran are actually very, very difficult for everybody, for the Iranian regime and for the US also. I mean, the US can easily go and obliterate, Iran completely in terms of missiles and bombs, etc. But that won't necessarily solve any problem, make it worse, in my opinion. So I think as far as India is concerned, India can only hope that better sense prevails both in Tehran and outside, and there is some sort of negotiated settlement with the protesters, with the people of Iran, because the oppressive environment that currently exists, it's suffocating. So I think the people of Iran deserve much better.
Right. Before I move to the next question, I want to ask you one from the chat box. Ishita, she asks, given the uncertainty surrounding Chabahar port, how can India navigate regime change risks abroad to safeguard its national interests?
I think that's a good question, because, as I said, Chabahar is important to us, and it should be important to us. And I think and we have actually run the gamut of, sanctions, the vicissitudes of, the geopolitics in terms of Iran's relations with United States and Europe. We have gone through all that, and we've been patient enough. When I said I went in November 2011, and we were already planning to invest and build, the Behesti port and others, the terminal, which we did. So I think we have invested. I don't think the amounts invested are so large that, it becomes a big dead loss for us. But certainly, if the US administration does not exempt us from pursuing this project, we'll need to hold it in abeyance. We should not give it up. I recall that when I was in charge of the division, we had a very big gas field given to us, to ONGC. I think it was called the Farzad B. And we weren't able to proceed because of sanctions. But eventually the Iranians as far as I recall, took it away from us. I do hope that that doesn't happen as far as Chabahar is concerned, because I think it's a very important project strategically for us, and we must continue evincing interest, even though the environment or the atmosphere may not be very propitious at this time. But things will pass, even in the US. In fact, the previous questioner had asked about what happens in the US. We'll have to wait and see what happens in the US. The midterms are due this year in November. So I think, things will change. I mean, it's not that the things won't change. So I think we'll have to wait and see. Certainly keep our heads down and pursue our interests.
Right. The next question is from Sudarshana Sarkar.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shubhajit. And sir, thank you so much for that in-depth information. So in the context of this developing geopolitical situation, we had been expecting certain moves from Russia and China. My question to you is, since you are a diplomat, what do you think is going to be the first move? Like, it will be a direct encounter with the small deliberate skirmishes? Second, like indirect encounters through developing nations? Or the third, twisted strategic international trade moves? What do you think would be the move from China and Russia? This being number one, I can't help but asking, continuation of this question further, like now that the focus suddenly have redirected towards Greenland, right? With European nations and Japan escalating their defense expenditure. How do you sort out this entire complicated geopolitical scenario? Thank you so much. I hope I get some kind of an answer.
Well, I'm an ex-diplomat, and if I could solve all these problems, I hope you'd nominate me for the Nobel Peace Prize.
But yeah, the last date is still 31st of Jan, so we have time.
Jokes apart, I think you asked a very, very loaded question. You see, as far as the reaction of Russia and China, it's been surprisingly muted. In case of Venezuela, obviously in the case of Iran, it won't be that muted. But I doubt very much that they would want to enter the fray militarily, because that would lead to a world war, and I think nobody wants a world war. So I think they will try and see how they react in terms. They may supply the Iranian regime. They probably already are supplying the Iranian regime with equipment, but whether that will suffice against the overwhelming might of the US is something that remains to be seen. And going by what happened in Venezuela and going by what happened in Op Sindhu, when we managed to overwhelm the defenses of Pakistan, I'm not sure whether they will succeed. Yes, as far as trade, etc., is concerned, I think the tariff, the tariff cards are being held somewhere else, and being weaponized somewhere else. I'm not sure whether the Chinese or Russians can do it. The Chinese certainly have leverage which they have used in the trade war against the US, and used it quite effectively against the US. So I don't think it will come to a situation, at least I hope not, where there is going to be even a limited military skirmish, because that is really too horrendous to envisage, because as I said, that could lead to something far, far worse. So I think we'll have to wait and see. I do not think there's going to be a military skirmish between, say, China, Russia, and the United States. Certainly, China and the and Russia will arm and support Iran as best as they can. Whether that would be enough, I doubt very much.
Right. Before I move to the next question from the chat box, there is a question by Pranav Jayakrishnan. He asks a very important question. American action against Venezuela and Iran, does it reinforce American global leadership, or does it reveal the limits of American power in a multipolar world?
Again, a very good question. I think, in my opinion, this is the actions of a declining power, because the United States is by far the sole superpower in terms of military strength. It's unmatched, but other countries, particularly China, are catching up. China particularly is catching up. So I think hitting out like this is obviously to demonstrate that they are, unmatched in terms of military prowess is concerned. But you go back to, the Thucydides trap, where an emerging power challenges the existing superpower. It's happened in history. It may happen not the way we would commonly understand, because the US is still very much the preeminent power. So I think it's declining because of the actions being taken by the current US administration, whether pertaining to Greenland, whether pertaining to its allies in Europe, or weaponizing tariff and economic. I heard an argument yesterday which I found simply astounding, that if the prices of medicine in the US are high and in Europe they are much lower, then Europe must increase their prices of medicine. So I couldn't understand the logic of that, and perhaps because I'm not really an economist, perhaps the logic escaped me. But what I'm trying to say here is that the US is not going away anytime soon. They are the preeminent power. They will be for the foreseeable future. But yes, have they peaked and are they declining? That is a question that remains to be answered. I personally feel that with this administration, U.S. power will only wane.
Okay. Before I end the conversation, I have a few questions from the chat box, and one question that is recurring in several questions is the role of the UN. In all these situations, the role of the UN has been found wanting, or has it sort of completely failed us after 80 years of being there, and now it appears that it is toothless?
Shubhajit, I am not a multilateralist, but I have served for almost 3.5 years in the UN at the turn of the century, including during 9/11. So I have seen the UN work up front very, very closely. The UN has failed. The UN has failed in its objectives in terms of maintaining peace and security in the world. Of course, there hasn't been a major world war or conflagration since World War II. So in that sense, the UN perhaps has prevented that happening. But right now, the UN has been completely marginalized. The UN Security Council is moribund. The veto-wielding powers call the shots. And I think it's become a relic of the past. And the composition of the Security Council is anachronistic. It doesn't reflect current ground realities. And India has been asking for the reform of the Security Council and the larger UN system for decades now. And not only India, but many countries. But nothing really has happened. And as a result, you have now forums and institutions being set up to clearly bypass and marginalize, and if I dare say, undercut the UN.
Right. My last question from Mr. K Sinha, again on the chat box. He's asking, what will be the future course of action of USA to deal with the Khamenei regime, as Israel wants regime change at any cost?
Regime change is easier said than done. I mean, and in a country like Iran, which is really big, it's happened in the past. The US has succeeded in regime change. Mossadegh was removed in 1952 or 53. There have been cases, Libya, Gaddafi, there was concerted military action, and then Gaddafi was removed, Saddam Hussein was removed. So there are many instances in the region where the leadership or the leaders have been taken out, or the military subdued. But in Iran, it would take perhaps more to do that. And I'm not sure whether any country really has the stomach to do that, including Israel, at this point of time, because that would lead to a lot of bloodshed.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinha, for joining us. This was a very, very insightful conversation, discussion, with all the questions that you sort of answered so honestly, so frankly, even put on the hat of a joint secretary and an ambassador in current times, although you retired a few years ago. I will now hand over to Manas to close this session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. K Sinha. Thank you, Shubhajit. Now, this brings us to the end of today's discussion on the US moves on Venezuela and Iran and what it could lie ahead, what could lead. We saw keen curiosity from our viewers and received several sharp questions. I'm sure Shubhajit will agree, because he was managing both the discussion and looking into questions and reflecting on how closely the issue is being watched. Unfortunately, due to paucity of time, we couldn't take all of them, but most of them were answered while the discussion was going on. But we'll continue this conversation sometime else, and we'll continue with Explained Live by the Indian Express, taking important issues and explaining to you in the most lucid manner with our editors and our guest experts. That's all from me now. Thank you so much. Keep watching the Indian Express.
Thank you. Thank you.